So money needs to be something that is accepted for an exchange of goods and services. But in order to truly be considered money, it needs to do a few more things. That's where we get to essentially the three things that money has to do to be money. This is where I start talking about Bitcoin, because people ask about Bitcoin. Is Bitcoin money? Well, it depends on which economist you ask. There's that annoying answer again. It depends. Some economists say this. Some economists think it is money. Others say not so much. So let's think about both fiat money. Fiat money is defined as money that is not something like a cow that has intrinsic value. It has no intrinsic value. It's just put out there as, hey, this is money. Now accept it. Bitcoin is actually, if it is money, it's a form of fiat money. It has no intrinsic value as anything but a medium of exchange. That's this second thing right here. It has to be a medium of exchange to be money, whether it's soybeans, cows, seashells, or whatever. If two people can come together and agree to trade whatever they've got for whatever is being used as money for something that has nothing to do with what the buyer or the seller is exchanging or able to exchange, then it's a medium of exchange. It's in the middle. It's the medium. And it's going to be used for something else. That's one thing that has to be a characteristic of the commodity in question if it's going to be money. It also has to be a unit of account. I mentioned that wealth is measured using money. Money is used to measure things, and we know this. It's $20 worth of my time that I had to spend not going to work because I get paid $20 an hour. If you get paid $20 an hour, that's not exactly what I get paid for this, but we often do measure things in terms of money. We know what $100 means. Even if we don't know it explicitly, we do know how much that's going to buy us, how many of our bills it can pay, and we know how long it's going to take for us to earn that money with whatever we generally do to earn money. So money, if it can measure things, if it's a unit of account, it counts as money. And then the other thing it has to be, and this is where it gets a little controversial, a little dicey, and where some of the debate about Bitcoin comes in. Does it store value? No money stores value perfectly. Remember inflation. You keep something in the form of money and inflation happens, which it pretty much always does, then your value goes away. But we're not talking about storing value perfectly forever. We're talking about storing value between paychecks or for several months or even a few years. Is at least most of that value still going to be in your money? If the answer is yes, most of that value is there, then it counts as money. You can store your value in that medium of exchange until you're ready to use it. With barter, oftentimes you have to exchange a good or service immediately, and consumption can, doesn't necessarily have anything to do with consumption, but whatever you provide, you got to provide it almost immediately. But you don't always, sometimes whatever you received in trade, you don't want to consume it right away. This is why, by the way, food is pretty much never considered money. Food can be a unit of account. You can technically value things in terms of the number of cucumbers that you would be willing to accept in exchange for a good or service. And that would then be a medium of exchange, but they'll rot pretty quick. So it needs to be something more durable in order to store value. So fiat money is money. It's a unit of account, medium of exchange, and it stores value. Does that include Bitcoin? Well, you can measure things in terms of Bitcoins. And a lot of people, at least those who trade Bitcoins, will know what 8 Bitcoins, what that's worth. You can have fractions of Bitcoins too. If people will exchange goods or services for Bitcoins, then it works as money. But storing value, Bitcoin, its value can be very volatile. And that's why a lot of economists say it's not money. It's a commodity that you can store off to the side, but then you have to do some other trade in order to turn it into money, so it doesn't count. Other economists will point to hyperinflated currencies and say, those don't store value very well, but we still consider those money, don't we? Well, then why not Bitcoin? So the debate rages on, but these are essentially the characteristics that need to be there for money to be considered money. Now, intrinsic value is important. And this is where a lot of people will say that fiat money, its days are numbered, and cryptocurrency, whether Bitcoin or something else, that's the money of the future. And fiat money is going to go away forever. Maybe. None of us can really predict the future, but it's always important to keep in mind alternative arguments. Why might fiat money not go away? This is something that usually isn't taught in an introductory course, but something that I encountered in graduate school, thanks to the great Stephen Pressman. I keep bringing him up. That's how you know he's a great professor. I learned a lot from him. I actually did my history of thought paper. He was our professor on Carl Menger. And since it was all about money, that was his really big contribution. Where does money come from? How does it get its value? When trying to figure out what to do with my paper, he's the one who introduced me to the idea of chartalism, which sounded somewhat absurd at first, but as I studied it a little more, it really does make perfect sense. Where does fiat money get its value? Well, chartalism it is essentially a fancy way of saying fiat money gets its value because it's going to be accepted as a form of tax payment. A government issues money. You can give that money back to the government when it's time to pay taxes. You got to pay taxes. Everyone in the economy is going to have to pay taxes, which means everyone in the economy at some point, they're going to need to have at least a certain amount of fiat money in order to pay their taxes. As long as there are taxes, there has to be fiat money. Governments are not likely to, at least for the foreseeable future, accept Bitcoin or cows or anything else, but they'll always accept their own currency. So fiat money will always have value because it's something that people are going to need to have to mediate that exchange with the government when it's time to pay their tax bill. And this is why, unless a currency becomes so badly hyperinflated that it has no value for anything else, most people will accept money as a medium of exchange, fiat money as a medium of exchange, because everybody's going to need it to pay their taxes. So just an interesting aside on fiat money and where it does get something like intrinsic value, even though the strict definition of fiat money is that it has no intrinsic value. So we've been talking about money and payments, but we know that there are a lot of different ways of making payments. And so when we talk about even money here in the United States, fiat money, cash, dollars, there are still a lot of things that we mean. So there are essentially two ways of dividing money. There are technically more than two ways, but in this class we only focus on M1 and M2. So what are these? Now, there's something called M0, which is base money. That's when the Federal Reserve invents money, and it hasn't gotten out in the economy yet. You don't need to worry about that. We don't really cover that in this class, but it is something that some macro classes will bring up. And then M3 and above are other forms of money that some economists insist should be included. But we really only focus on M1 and M2 in part because that's what the Federal Reserve focuses on. They really only have data on M1 and M2 money supply. They'll have other ways of tracking money, but these are the main two. So M1 is the most liquid. What does liquidity mean? Well, liquidity simply means the degree to which an asset can be readily converted into payment. Here it says currency, but really it's payment. Do you have to sell it? Like if you have a bond is not very liquid. You have to go to a bond market and find a buyer, which can take days, weeks, months, depending on the grade of the bond or how good you are at shopping it around. That's not very liquid. A house stores your wealth pretty well. It's not very liquid. Houses sit on markets for months before they find a buyer. Again, months can go by, or you could sell it in one day, but it takes a while to get that wealth out. It's not very liquid. You know what's really liquid, though? A $5 bill. And you can spend that right away. Most vending machines will take a $5 bill. So that's as liquid as it gets. So M1 money. Those are the most liquid assets. But which assets are we talking about? Well, cash is one of them. Checking accounts or checkable deposits, since economists have to get all fancy. That's money. Basically, the test is, do you have to wait a couple days if it's a weekend for the bank to be open to walk into the bank and talk to a teller and withdraw money from a special account? Or can you just go to the ATM at 3 in the morning on a Saturday night? If you can go to an ATM at 3 in the morning on a Saturday night, then you've got pretty liquid money. That's a checking account, and that is the M1 money supply. The other thing that's in M1, we actually have those here. Traveler's checks. Anybody ever heard of traveler's checks? I wonder if in about 50 years, if we're going to include this traveler's checks part in the M1 money supply anymore, if we're going to still teach it in econ classes, maybe in history of economics classes. Traveler's checks are something that you get when you go somewhere that might not take your dollars. When I was a TA, I was already a little older, and our instructor, when we got to this part, she went right to me in that big lecture hall and asked if I knew what they were. And I just had to say, okay, yeah, you go to the old bald guy to signify that only old people know what traveler's checks are. I actually remember going on a trip with some extended family from Colorado to Arizona, and we got traveler's checks to make sure they would take our money, which now that I think about it, is why on earth did we do that? The one time I ever left the country was in the year 2000. I went to Scotland, and I got traveler's checks. And they were already starting to become pretty archaic then. We're in such an interconnected world now, it's weird to think that anybody ever would need something like traveler's checks, but we do. Well, we did once upon a time, but we kind of don't anymore. I didn't even need them in the year 2000. There was one grocery store that would accept them, and I ended up just taking them all there, and for everything else that I did, I would go to the ATM at the Royal Bank of Scotland and make a withdrawal from the credit union that I had my money in Colorado. And I would withdraw the money, and then there would be the message on the screen: the Royal Bank of Scotland had not charged you for this transaction. However, your financial institution might have, because even the words in Scotland have an accent, right? I just went to the ATM to get money out of my account. I didn't need the traveler's checks even in the year 2000. But there are still traveler's checks out there. Believe it or not, about 0.01% of the M2 money supply consists of traveler's checks. $1.9 billion worth of traveler's checks out there, at least last time I looked it up. That's out of a $20 trillion economy, or whatever it is after this coronavirus thing. That's not a lot. That basically means that there are still old people who think they need them. I don't think anyone under the age of maybe 70 gets traveler's checks anymore. But they're still a thing. They're still out there. They're still tracked, so we still include them here. Now, I said M2, but this is listed under M1. So what is M2 money? Over here, the broader measure of the money supply. It includes M1. So traveler's checks are part of M1 and M2. Everything in M1 is part of M2. We'll get into the rest of it in the next video because, again, I'm trying to keep these under 15 minutes. So take a break if you need to, and then we'll watch the next